Welcome to the Global Amphitheatre stage of this, the final day of the World Education Summit 2022. My name is Dawn Hayward and it's my utter privilege to be your host for today. Throughout the session that we are just about to hear, please engage by posting your comments in the chat function, and it's always great to hear some of the things that resonate for you as you're listening to our speaker. Equally, please feel free to post your questions and I will be able to read a selection of those out at the end of our session. So it's now my great privilege to introduce our next session. The title of our next session is Portfolios of Contribution: Learning as Action for a Better World. Our speaker today is Dr. Benjamin Freud. Dr. Benjamin Freud started his career consulting for internet startups in Silicon Valley in the late 1990s, working with people whose ambitions were no less than to change the world. This experience had a profound effect on Benjamin's outlook on education, innovation, and entrepreneurialism. Benjamin is also a school leader of learning and teaching at an international school in Thailand, and he is speaking to us now from Phuket. Absolutely looks wonderful there. He's just shown us a little picture of what it looks like out of his window. And his work is centered around creativity, sustainability, and community. He's also worked in Mink schools in Saudi Arabia and has been the vice principal of middle and high schools in Hong Kong. And it is now my utter privilege to introduce our next session and our next speaker, Dr. Benjamin Freud.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to try the hardest part of this, which is the side of sharing my screen. So I think we did a bit of run through, so it should work out just well. I think that should work. Does that work? Can you see it?
Absolutely. That looks perfect.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So this is a conversation about portfolios of contribution, and by conversation I mean that I really would encourage comments to come at any point so that we can talk to each other, what resonates, questions that might come up, and really try and engage as much as possible through this medium in a conversation now and later. So this is me. Thank you very much for the intro. I really don't have much to add. That was a fantastic piece. I just wanted to point out one thing though, and that is the fact that I do come from a perspective of having lived in, very lucky to have lived in a few countries. My mother worked for the French government, and I followed her around. And I did work in Silicon Valley in the early 90s, and these were with some people who were just, they just had a can-do attitude. Nothing was going to stop them from changing the world in the late 90s. And nothing mattered more than their ability to come up with creative ideas and things that nobody had ever thought of before. And that was what was driving the whole community in Silicon Valley. I also worked with more blue chip companies, FMCGs, financial services, and so forth, and then moved into education. I've got a very academic background, and I think that, I don't know if it's in spite of or because of that academic background, that I really would like to move education, learning, whatever it is, learning in all its forms, in all its places, beyond academics, and looking at different ways of thinking about who we are as individuals and how we fit into the community. And lastly, because sometimes these introductions are all about CVs, or I've worked here, or I've worked there, I wanted to let you know that one of the words that really resonates with me as someone who practices yoga and is just interested in ancient wisdom is the word pravaha, which is a Sanskrit for flow and current. And the reason that word resonates with me, and this might frame this conversation today, is because the world really is in a static place. On our website, Coconut Thinking, which is where we have a blog and a podcast, and you see at the bottom on www.coconut-thinking.design, we're really thinking about how we aren't beings. We use this word beings, but we're not static. We're becomings. We are always at the intersection of past and future. And so we can, in that sense, develop a greater whole. This is a lot of stuff that we'll get into, but I just want to plant that the word current and flow really represents how I feel about the universe and about who we are. And I want to also let you know that we'll go into a little bit more about, some more of the science behind that, not just the spiritual woo-woo, as some people might call this. And I say that with a smile. So I'd like to signpost this conversation first. This is about portfolios of contribution and what that means. Now, the words portfolios have come up quite a lot, and I'll talk about this in a second, about what that might mean, how we might gather evidence of learning through portfolios. But the first thing I want to signpost is that these are meant to complement transcripts in K-12. They're not something that people bring up after when they're working or in university. This is something that really follows learners throughout their K-12 experience. And so these portfolios are about rethinking what evidence of learning, and especially, and very importantly, what evidence of action and what evidence of impact is involved here. So they require us to think about assessment in different ways. And that means that rather than having assessment be about passing a test or showing some skills or even competencies, we're really thinking about the impact that our actions have. It's about also, and this is the part that probably will shake most people, but when we think about it, and we'll get into this, it's not something that's entirely weird or that part different, but it's about thinking about assessment of the individual and the collective. I wanted to put the word team there, but it's even more than that. It's not just about the people who are working on a project. It's about how the voices of those who are impacted and influenced on the project, how they react. So we're really looking at it through a living systems lens. We're really looking at it through an ecosystemic point of view, where it's any action takes into account everyone who is involved, including, of course, those who are recipients of those actions. And this means bringing in the voices of the community. And that's where the portfolios might be different from some of the other portfolios of learning, is that we hear from other folks. And lastly, and this is the most critical part, what this means isn't actually that different from what professionals do. Everyone listening to this has a CV, has a resume, and on those resumes, it has usually bullet points or some kind of measurement or yardstick or story or whatever it might be about the difference they made in the organization. It's not about, I went on this this course, or I know how to do this. That happens, of course, sometimes at the bottom of a CV, but usually it's about, I have grown the business. I have helped such and such students. I have raised achievement, whatever it might be. We are already, as professionals, thinking about impact. Teachers often have binders full of the impact on learning that they have. So this is about thinking like this within schools at the K-12 level. So I'd like this to be about questions. I'm not, maybe making it a little bit more dynamic. Interviews are really dynamic ways of having conversations. And so from that point of view, I'm going to ask myself questions. And this is why I mentioned that it'd be great if you came in, and I might wave your hands if anybody has questions at some points, because it just makes it a more dynamic experience. But the questions I'm going to ask are first going to be towards you, the audience. And these are the questions. Think about where you are today, where you have been, and where you're going, and ask yourself, how are you adding to a wider story? How are you diminishing a wider story? And how are you writing a new story? Because I'm going to propose that everything that we do is about the story that we tell, the story that we write. Everything is about what we've done, how we treat other people, how our place in the world fits, how it doesn't fit, what it is that we want to do. And this is where the contribution piece comes in. Contribution doesn't have to be about filling the hole in the ozone layer. It could be something about just being kind, just being the person that you might be in a situation where you might help someone on a very small basis. But how are we adding to a wider story? That's not always necessarily a good thing if the wider story is racism. Just like diminishing a wider story isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's about, say, diminishing impact of carbon footprints or diminishing a situation where there's bullying or whatever it might be. And also the question, how are you writing a new story, if at all? Should there be a new story written? Should we change some of the elements of an already existing story? These are really the things that we need to think about if we're going to act ethically. This is really the things that we need to think about if we're going to consider our place in the world, not just act blindly, but really with purpose. And I'm going to say this, I'm going to throw out already a controversial comment that learning by itself cannot be meaningful. We talk about meaningful learning, but it doesn't make any sense. And so I'll ask myself the question, what do you mean learning alone isn't meaningful? Well, the idea here is that learning without action can't have meaning. Here's the idea. Simple physics, probably that we learned in primary school. Learning, I'm going to consider it like potential energy. If I have the skills to do something, if I, for instance, have a certain set of skills for maths or literacy, writing, whatever it might be, it's just potential energy. I might know how to use a quadratic equation or multiply fractions. That's fantastic, but it's potential energy. It only becomes real when it turns into kinetic energy. And that kinetic energy, or I mean, it's still real energy, but it only becomes meaningful when it becomes action. Boulder falls, that's the action. Otherwise, it's just potential energy. And so generally in schools, we find many examples of ways of looking at potential energy. A reading diagnostic, writing an argumentative essay, multiplying fractions, whatever you want. All these things that we do when we assess kids, many times is about measuring the potential energy. How well can you comprehend a text? How well can you analyze a poem? How well do you know the dates of a certain event in social studies? How do you know the parts of a cell? Even when we apply those to perhaps some kind of activity or project, it still remains potential energy, because unless we do something with that learning, it's not meaningful. It doesn't have any kind of impact. The idea is here, the simple Zen koan of if a tree falls in the forest, does it make noise? Here's the story. I brought up my academic background for this very example. I wrote a dissertation on French colonial policy making in Indochina during World War II. Now, as of today, I have never received a phone call about an emergency relating to French colonial policy making in Indochina during World War II. I loved writing the dissertation. I loved the research. I loved the indulgence inside. But realistically, there are very few people who have ever read the dissertation. It didn't really have much impact, not direct impact. Now, maybe it taught me how to think, how to research, and that comes in to my experiences in the classroom. I get that. That's what really needs to be measured more so than the 300 pages or so that I wrote. It didn't have impact. So in many ways, what I learned about this, all my knowledge about this very esoteric topic is potential energy. But unless I use it, it's not turned into kinetic energy. It doesn't have impact. But we can, and often there's many educators, many schools that do employ this idea of these projects for impact that release the kinetic energy. Let's say we run a pet adoption campaign, or grow food for the homeless, or give a concert in a care home. All these things, and you can think of 1,000 more, 1,000,000 more. You're only limited by your creativity of things that transform learning into kinetic energy. So, for instance, if I think about running a pet adoption campaign, what are all the things that need to be happening there? Well, there's the typical content that we need. What do animals need to eat? What they're the biology, the zoology, how do we care for animals? We learn also literacy skills about marketing campaigns, about setting up videos, the technical skills there, maybe creating posters, narratives, speeches, places for influence. All of these things come into play, which will run an effective pet adoption campaign. Giving a concert in a care home, same thing. It's the music that we actually release in terms of kinetic energy at the care home. And it has impact, hopefully, by making the lives of those inside or who are listening better. So this isn't very much different from what happens a lot, but it's about shifting the focus away from the skills and even the competencies of character or creativity or whatever it might be, and thinking about the impact. And that's where these portfolios of impact are coming. So why portfolios or contribution or impact? We can talk about the two. I take the words of contribution from Joanne McEachen. But that really is just a question of semantics. Well, it's based on the very simple idea that we're all interconnected. It's based on the simple idea that we don't do anything alone, unless, of course, it's that potential energy where we don't release it towards action. But even then, we don't do it alone because we're framed by the context that we're in, our socioeconomic background, our gender, the classroom we're in, our friends, our teacher, our family, whatever it might be. Curriculum, of course. So we're in a situation where everything that we do in terms of action is connected to another person. It's connected to another life form. It doesn't even have to be a person. It could be an ecosystem. We pull together and contribute towards one another. I might do something to help the animals for a pet care home, but somebody's going to perhaps help me and teach me. Maybe it's the YouTube video that I watched in order to learn how to edit on Premiere Pro, somebody helped me in terms of that. Me helping the animals is hopefully going to get them rehomed somewhere and make maybe a little boy or little girl, like my kids who have 5 cats from pet shelters, maybe make them happier. So there is this real dynamic of everything rippling out in terms of our actions. If my kids, of course, are happy, maybe it makes their life, they're more empathetic, they care more, they'll do something out there that helps someone else. These are all things that have ripples. So rather than just looking at the skills for that pet care rehoming organization or campaign, let's think about the impact that it has on the people who deserve, who benefited from it. The animals, of course, the community in terms of the homes that have been affected, and thinking about bringing in those voices. And so the idea here, and I promised you that this wasn't just going to be spiritual stuff, it is really into quantum physics. Now, I'm going to put it out there. I don't understand very much about quantum physics. I'm barely dipping the edge of my toe into a vast pool out there. So, and there certainly isn't going to be a lesson on that because I'm the wrong person. But I do know enough to know that they have experiments out there where they shoot photons from vastly different parts of vastly different farther out areas, and those photons react exactly the same way, and as if they were, it's called entanglement, and they don't have time to send each other signals because the distance is greater than light would have time to go. So there is this idea of entanglement. There is this idea in quantum physics also about not being able to measure. This idea of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle that you can't both know the movement of an electron, the velocity at which an electron is moving, as well as its position. It just doesn't make sense. And it goes back to things like Zeno's arrow and arrow of time and all these other really esoteric things that nerds like me really get into. So there's a physics side behind this, about this interconnectedness. There's a physical side here, knowing that in the universe, there is no empty space. And so we are all connected as one. And this is a lot of David Bohm's work on wholeness and the intricate order, that we are all together as one, and then we are actually just holes nested in bigger holes. This is quantum physics, but it's also biology. It's the idea that you have a heart, which is a whole in itself, which is part of your cardiovascular system, which is a whole ecosystem, which is part of you. You're part of the community. You're part of a species. You're part of a life form on Earth, which is a planet in the solar system. We're all these nested holes. And so nothing that we do exists in isolation. And so this is where the portfolios of contribution come in. It's this idea that because we are all interconnected physically and beyond the physical, just in every single way possible, then everything that we do should take into account everyone and everything on which we have impact, which is all the time and every moment. And this is, again, going into the idea of we're not beings, we're becomings, because we are this interaction, this dynamic interaction between others, ourselves, the world, the air, the plants, everything together. Just like this idea of the butterfly that flaps its wings creates a storm somewhere else, or whatever the story might be. And so perhaps we should think about ourselves in terms of a web, and learners are each little node within this web in the universe. And so as they are so, they contribute to other parts of the node, and there is this idea of impact. And so we take learning from this potential energy to the kinetic energy of how do we have impact on others, and how do we capture the voices of those who have impact. And that, as an evidence of learning and action, is very powerful, because then it becomes real. When you can bring in the voices of people that you have helped, that you have benefited, who have received the efforts of your contribution, then it's a real story that we're telling. And these stories, if I'm going to be a little bit clinical about it, are really going to complement transcripts, university applications, whatever it might be that get us ahead in society. But also, of course, it just tells a story of who we are. So I'm going to ask myself some questions about portfolios of contribution, as if I was going to interview myself. And really, it's the idea of asking, first of all, is learning fashioned as inherently selfish in our system? And could portfolios of contribution change that? Well, that's the thing about selfishness. Scientific revolution really changed our attitude and our relationship with nature. with Descartes and with Bacon, there was really this idea of separating ourselves from nature. Now, of course, you can go back to the Greeks with this as well, but they really did this in a way that really destroyed our understanding of our place in the natural world. Bacon said, torture nature out of her secrets. Descartes also, with his I think therefore I am, separated our mind from our bodies and therefore from nature. And so this is something that has really only come out over the last 500 years in Western, and I use those terms with quotes, society. In indigenous cultures, this is generally, and I'm not going to say never because I don't want to use those extremes, but it's generally not the case. Whether it be indigenous cultures from the Arctic or the Amazon or Africa or Australia, there is this sense that we are at one with nature. There is this sense that there is no disconnection. There is this sense that us hurting nature hurts us because, going back to this idea that we are nested wholes. So is our learning inherently selfish? It is, in a system that atomizes students, that has them compete against one another for scores, that is part of a scarcity-based way of thinking about getting to the right university, the elite university, and of course, I have to do this in order to get my status in the world. My children have to go there, they have to work hard. I think it was Michael Sandel who said that meritocracy was the last form of acceptable discrimination. The pieces of paper on your wall are a ticket to places that you wouldn't access without those. So is our system selfish? Well, yeah, it's built to be selfish. It's absolutely 100% built to be selfish, and the way we assess students individually reinforces that selfishness. I'll put it out there as maybe a provocation. So the idea now is to ask, can portfolios of contribution tell the stories of learning and impact? Well, I hope I touched a little bit about this, but if we can create stories and narratives around the good that we do, that is something different. Portfolios of learning are generally sometimes, I don't know, about like my favorite piece of writing or my favorite piece of math homework or whatever, like my favorite piece of art. They're still very much driven by this idea of potential energy. They're still very much about like something that's polished and we show it and this is what I did this year. But it doesn't do anything to release that energy. And it certainly doesn't do anything to talk about action and how that impacts others. So what if we could create portfolios where we not just document it to the learning and the journey that we did to get there, but also in terms of the impact that it had on others, those animals, documenting their stories, their lives, the voices of the people who receive the resheltered pets. That's something that really is going to give it a more life-driven, life-centered power to these portfolios and really show that it's not just about ourselves, the selfishness, it's about giving, it's about contributing. And that really shifts the conversation. It also means that we're not necessarily doing it individually, but if we work on projects as a team, then it means that we're assessing groups, teams, the community, whatever it might be, which has action. And that's okay. Because in most organizations, they are being assessed, whatever that means, by P&L, by KPIs, whatever you want to do, based on the team efforts, based on what that department delivers. So it's not something that's utterly foreign to us. Companies live and die based on their ratings on, I don't know, TripAdvisor or whatever it might be on from the Better Business Bureau or maybe whatever other kind of system there is of spoken word or written word, and that's as a collective, as a company. So it's not that incredibly different. And so another question might be: do the contents of portfolio grow and diminish over time as students themselves grow and falter? Well, yeah, absolutely, because it tells us about our journey. It tells us about who we are changing as. I'm not the same person I was a month ago. I'm certainly not the same person I was 2 years ago. And our students from grade 10 to grade 11 aren't the same people. So they will grow, they will diminish, they will have strengths. Those strengths might go on the upskill and then maybe plateau. Some of the areas for development might pick up, or maybe they might take a dip. But these are the stories that we're trying to tell of our journeys as learners and as doers. So we're not just learners. I put the word students in here. I dislike that word, but I'll leave it for simplicity's sake. But we're not just doers. We're really people who are taking action and who want to contribute to the world. So maybe we should call learners contributors. Let's see if we can think about that within the ecosystem. But telling that story about these different projects that sometimes might have failed and telling the story of what that is and then what we learn and going forward to the next project, hearing from other folks about how we've made their life better, that's really powerful. And that's a story that is never really told, as far as I know, in schools. Sometimes it is, but never in terms of something that sticks with you, like a transcript. And of course, this opens up another conversation about blockchain and how we can use it in that way. So I'm gonna wrap it up here, and I know that I said I'd be open for questions. I haven't, in one way or another, opened myself up to that. So I want to just moving this away that really this is a different way, and it's a different way that might challenge the system. In fact, it's a different way that maybe might create a new system. But we need to realize our interconnections, or maybe we should realize, or maybe some people won't realize these interconnections. That's okay. But for those of us who do, those of us who understand that we are interconnected and that learning and action are not just something that happened within the individual, but are part of everything within the living world, we realize that impact is about not just us, but it's about the other. It's about thinking about ourselves and our effect on the world. And it ends this idea of separation. It ends this Cartesian mechanistic idea of separation and really gets into regeneration, really reconnects to ourselves. I didn't say connect, just reconnect because we've been disconnected from it and others and the planet. And I'm going to push that even this idea of ourselves, others, and the planet is just a way to kind of frame the issue, but there is no difference because we are interconnected. We do I fragmented into 3 different things, but really it's all the same thing. And that really, maybe it's this Ubuntu idea of I am because we are. Maybe it's this idea of we are in the system together. We compartmentalize and we fragment in order to understand. And then, of course, it's the shift in consciousness. And this will take a long time. I'm not offering something that's going to be done next month. Maybe it's going to be a decade, maybe 2 decades. If we have time, if the planet doesn't burn up. There is a practical element here because we can't gather these stories, and I'd love to have conversations about how we can do this, how we gather the stories, and then present the portfolio of evidence of impact, not just in terms of shifting social consciousness of 8 billion people. And again, it's radical, but it's familiar because your CVs right now, if you look them up, is all about the impact that you have. So I'll leave you with one question, which is, where do you go from here? I believe more and more that we have been talking about changing the system for at least 100 years. John Dewey, Maria Montessori, whatever, it's been around for a long time. And yet we're still talking about how we're going to change the system. We're still talking about the future of education. Where in UNESCO's case, the future is of education, but that's a different situation. Because that takes the conversation to maybe a different set of values. And looking at some of the work, I don't know, Peter Senge or others in Carol Sanford in regenerative and living systems thinking, we have to ask ourselves, can we really change the system if we have the same values? And if we have the courage to adopt different values, that will create a different system. We might have to look at the values that we have first before we even think about changing the system. Because if we still value the same thing, the meritocratic system, extractive mentalities, individualism, the system's never going to change. No matter what they say about, the pandemic has changed everything. It hasn't, because we'll still value the same things. So this is what I invite you to think about. And lastly, and I'll leave you with this, and I ask this time, how are we, not just how are you, but how are we adding to a wider story? How are we diminishing a wider story? And how are we writing a new story? How are we doing this together? How are we coming together as a collective? Not just of humans, but also of every living thing on Earth. So this is our website, www.coconut-thinking.design. We've got some blogs on there. We've got podcasts. We're really excited to share these ideas, and even better, I have to say, more excited to hear from others and their thoughts, and building on this conversation. We really are intent on co-creating the conversation, and building it, having dialogue, and seeing where we can go from here. So thank you very much. You can find me on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and of course on the World Education Summit platform and through this website. So now I will unshare the screen. Second hardest thing to do technically. There we go. Thank you.
Brilliant
Thank you.
and perfectly done and absolutely seamless and certainly a very thought-provoking, inspiring but both challenging at the same time. I actually spoke in a session earlier in the week and there was a quote that I read out that I'll read out today because what you've said made me smile. It's a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King and it says, "Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality." And I think that's a great quote to summarize some of the interdependence and how our actions impact others. And I like the notion of potential energy and kinetic energy, and how our kinetic energy is a force for good, a positive impact on others. I have a question around the extent to which we intentionally teach character virtues for young people, particularly perhaps character virtues of compassion and empathy, or the extent to which the activities that young people are engaged in enable young people to perhaps develop those more intuitively than intentionally. Do you have a view on the extent to which we are intentional about the development of some of those character virtues?
That's a great question, and I think there's this the issue I have really in many learning systems or ways of thinking is that it's an outside in situation, right? We go in and fill the pail with knowledge and content skills of someone. It's outside in. But the character development, doing that more intuitive piece, is an inside out, and that's absolutely wonderful, and that's really the optimal piece of learning. I do think that there's probably a balance, and it's everything is about balance here between, and again, if we think about these feedback loops between having the intuition there, but also the intention, because the quote that you gave of Martin Luther King about the interconnectedness is so powerful, and yet, in addition to that, people have been talking about interconnectedness for at least 2,500 years in philosophies, in Taoism, with more than that, in the Vedas, way more than 2,500 years ago, Buddhism, in indigenous cultures, probably 5,000, 10,000 years. So this idea of interconnectedness is still very much with us, but also with that mindfulness. And I don't mean the mindfulness that we have when we say, oh, let's all be mindful and we do 15 minutes of mindfulness and then go back to our crazy work. But really this idea of acting based on a set of ethics and being conscious of how we are acting, the mindfulness there. So maybe there's the duality there. There is an intuition, but also I think that we have to be intentional about our actions. And when it comes to teaching or perhaps creating context for developing those character traits in students, they should also realize that we have to think about our actions as we do it in the moment, at that present. Again, we are at the nexus of past and future. What are we doing at this very moment?
Wonderful. And there's it's interesting to perhaps think about how the reason why young people are developing their portfolios, is it for the professionals to mark and to judge, or is it for young people to tell their stories? And I think it'd be useful just to hear your response to that.
And that's the really the killer question, because ultimately we can talk about contribution and being selfless and interconnected. We can talk about changing the system, but if we think about nested wholes, the system, even if we created a whole new system with our own new ethics and ethos and all these experiences, we will never be disconnected from the old system until the old system completely disappears, because everything is interconnected. And looking for a job, going to university, telling the story, whatever, there's always going to be a certain amount of judgment's not the right word, of what's the word I'm looking for, of maybe sorting, right? There's only a few jobs for so many places. So I think it's going to have to be a little bit of both, at least in the medium term. I can't look beyond that. I don't have a crystal ball, but certainly it will be about telling those stories. But it'll also be as a way of having a university and employer understand who we're bringing on. What is that person's story? Who are they? What have they done? How have they faced adversity? But not just in the typical way that we do with portfolios, but how are other voices coming in that have been involved in this? What is the story of the contribution and the stories of the community who have been involved? So it will have to be still part of a sorting process, because ultimately you're trying to do something with that. with those portfolios, but it's a different narrative than this is my favorite piece of writing and my score on my IB test or IB is a 42.
And I can see from the, I can see all the attendees who are watching and listening to us now, and I can see that many of them are practitioners, people who are either teaching or leading schools or indeed groups of schools, and really intrigued around, and it's making me certainly reflect as a leader of a group of schools around the portfolios of contribution and what they look like and how we meaningfully enable and support young people to develop portfolios of contribution. Could you perhaps share a little around tangibly how we support young people to develop those?
Sure, great question, and it's context based. It's based, of course, on the evidence that maybe might have to be done there, like in terms of state mandates. Maybe that comes in. That's a fuzzy place. It'll also depend on the school, depend on all these things, but most importantly, it'll depend on the learner. Because after all, it's their story. So we can help them with maybe a tech platform. We could help them maybe with some kind of technology medium that they're very comfortable with. It will have to be that, because I think telling that story will be part of that. However, I do think that it will probably involve a lot of documentation through video, through writing samples, through reflections, all the things that we're used to with portfolios. In many ways, there's nothing new here. What is new is the measurement, the bringing in the voices of those who have been impacted positively or even negatively, and create space for those, create space for the families, and having their eyewitness accounts, their own reflections about the process, those kinds of ideas. We could even, if we're really crazy, go into a post-qualitative setting where we just take pictures of what's happening without having any kind of data in terms of numbers or even the qualitative focus groups, or just pictures of what's happening, and just use that as telling a story. So the platform is of course context driven. What we put there are the voices of everyone in the community. I could also invite people to think about something else that's being used out there, and that's the idea of net promoter scores. Which is something, if ever you have a piece of technology, once in a while you have a window that pops up saying, would you recommend this application to a friend 0 to 10? And that's actually a very intentional piece of information that they get. They try to figure out who the detractors are, the promoters are, and the people who are neutral. But maybe having some kind of idea of how can we ask the people who have been impacted for some kind of, I don't know, it could be a mix of quantitative, qualitative, and post-qualitative information, but how could we capture their ability, their benefit of a certain experience? These are all things that we can still play around with. These are all things that are very context driven. But I would venture to say that if we thought about how a project impacted someone else, we could better think about how to reiterate and how to make that even better. And that drives the learning. Why wasn't this project completely successful from the other person's point of view? How are we collecting that information across the board? And what do we need to do next time to make it better? That's really powerful. So again, context driven, but stories of others, that makes a difference. And one last thing, I know it's quite a long answer, but it's quite a thing. One last thing, the really key thing about the portfolios of contribution is that it's not just any kind of project, it's one driven by a set of ethics. And that ethical lens isn't just about the sustainable development goal or this or that. It's really about hard ethics and how we hold ourselves accountable to it and how we drive intentionally those actions. At Coconut Thinking, we propose something like, how do our actions contribute to the thriving of the ecosystem or the thriving of the biocollective? And that's it. And every project is based on that. How are we thriving? We're asking at the beginning, we're asking at the end. That makes a difference. That shifts our thinking tremendously. And then we don't just do projects for nothing. We're asking, how does it benefit and make the ecosystem thrive?
Yeah, absolutely wonderful and incredibly, incredibly passionate, incredibly challenging, but equally incredibly important when we think about what it means to thrive, not just now, but thriving at an individual level, at I suppose, at a community level, and I guess even at a global and planetary level. The importance of understanding the impact of our actions. and the contribution that we make. I speak here around that we have 7,000 young people and 1,000 staff. So if all 8,000 of us took individual action, then that's the start of an amazing contribution.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of thriving, you know, Valerie Hannon, I'm not afraid about taking words from others. I'll always attribute. I don't steal. I'll attribute. But you know, that's how we have ideas have traction, using these words that we have a common understanding. But that's exactly right. If you have a few students, a few kids in your community who aren't doing well, that impacts others, and eventually the 7,000, and eventually their families.
Yeah, and I'd just like to finish with asking you a question that we're asking throughout the World Education Summit this week, and it really is around the notion of the next emerging horizons. So what do you see as the next emerging horizons within education?
I've written about this a lot on Coconut Thinking lately, so thank you for your question. It's one really where there's a tension. Well, there's three pieces of tension. Well, actually, let's stick with two. There's this idea of the virtual world, and that's completely changed everything. That now we can talk to anyone, anywhere, immediately. We're no longer tied to place when it comes to communication. I used to have to call you on a landline. You used to have to be at a fixed point, but now I can reach you anywhere in the world. That's going to create different networks of learning, different networks of communication, different networks of collaboration, and of course, contribution. If we think about the metaverse and how that will change things completely in terms of creating experiences that are going to be deeply sensory and alter our sense of reality, that's going to be absolutely massive further on, maybe 20, 30 years down the road. But the other piece of the tension is we're going to have to be very much localized. We're going to have to be back in touch with our local area, if nothing else, because we can't travel anymore. It's the carbon footprint's too intense. Shipping things on Amazon, shipping things intercontinentally just doesn't make sense anymore. We have to start thinking about these circular economies. We have to start thinking about how we're connecting with our local areas, our bio-locality, how we're building community here so that physically we might stay more local. So on the one hand, we can have all these experiences in the virtual world, and the metaverse might even make that, change that quite significantly. But I think in the next 10, 20 years, we might have to stay a lot more local. And that means being more in touch, knowing what the birds are called, what the trees are called, who our neighbors are. And that's where education actually breaks open. And it's no longer about the classroom. The classroom won't make any more sense because we can go anywhere with a headset, and yet we have to be in touch with what's outside. And so I think that what's on the horizon is there's not going to be such a thing as a classroom anymore. It's not going to be such a thing as school. I'll put it out there. School has reached the end of its product life cycle. We're ready to move on.
So, Dr. Benjamin Freud, thank you so much for that. I will finish with something that Louise has said, a comment from Louise, and she said, "This is making so much sense. Thank you for sharing and inspiring me to make a change." So. Absolutely, what a wonderful session, and thank you for both inspiring and also challenging us. So that reaches the end of this session. Thank you to Dr. Benjamin Freud, and thank you to all of you who've engaged within this session. Please, as you exit the session, take time just to complete the little poll at the end. It's always really important and valuable for us to have your feedback. Please enjoy the rest of the final day of the World Education Summit 2022. Thank you.
Thank you.